Welcome to today's historical deep dive, where we journey through the minds of giants and the turning points that shook the world. Today, we peel back the layers of a legend, not to celebrate triumph, but to confront the chilling reality of downfall. Was he the architect of a new age, or merely a magnificent tyrant, destined to crumble under the weight of his own crown? If you love immersive, real storytelling about ambition and downfall, hit like and subscribe. It helps us more than you know. Drop a comment with your favorite Napoleon quote or the moment that shocked you most. Let's begin and change the way you think about history. You stand knee-deep in snow, the biting wind a physical blow that steals your breath. The air is thick with the stench of unwashed bodies, dying horses, and distant wood smoke. This is the Berezina River, late November 1812. Not the grand crossing of the Neman you witnessed just months ago. Vibrant with hope and the gleaming might of 500,000 men surging eastward, but a desperate, chaotic scramble. The icy water is choked with debris, human and animal, as a tattered remnant attempts to escape the vengeful grip of Russia. Hastily built pontoon bridges groan under the weight, fragile threads over oblivion. Cannon roar, not in triumph, but in a frantic rearguard action against swarming Cossacks and relentless Russian regulars pressing in. Men slip on the ice-slicked banks, fall from the narrow bridges, and disappear beneath the frigid surface, their cries swallowed by the wind. Wagons break, precious, frozen supplies, food, ammunition, shelter, abandoned in the deepening drifts, a testament to a logistical collapse that mirrors the human one. The once invincible Grande Armée, the instrument of one man's will that had swept across Europe, is a shattered, starving, frostbitten mob, stripped of everything but the desperate instinct to survive. You scan the desperate scene for the Emperor. He is here, somewhere in the swirling snow, bundled in heavy furs, a figure diminished by the scale of the catastrophe. His face, when you catch a glimpse, is etched with fatigue, perhaps disbelief. He issues orders, sometimes attempting to rally the broken men with flashes of his old charisma, sometimes simply watching the horrifying disintegration of his life's work. The empire, built on conquest, melting like the snow in a brief, cruel thaw. This frozen hellscape is the consequence. This horrifying, frozen hellscape is the end result of a decision made back in the gilded palaces of Europe, a gamble against nature and human limits. How did the conqueror of Europe, the master of strategy who could predict enemy moves like pieces on a chessboard, find himself presiding over such a catastrophic, avoidable disaster? What fatal flaw, buried beneath layers of success and adulation, led him, here, to the brink of annihilation in the heart of a hostile wilderness? This is where we begin our exploration today. Not at the peak of his power, the dazzling coronation or the fields of Austerlitz, but at the nadir, the moment the storm he unleashed turned back upon him. Not with the trumpet blast of victory, but with the groan of a dying empire and the whisper of death on the wind. The principle we explore today is not merely about victory or defeat, but about the seeds of defeat sown by success itself. It's the story of how unparalleled ambition, unchecked power that heard no dissent, and a refusal to acknowledge brutal reality can take the world's most powerful man and bring him, and 500,000 souls who followed him, to the edge of oblivion. It is tragically ironic that the man who mastered armies and nations was ultimately undone by the simple, unstoppable forces of winter and overreach. The lesson begins in the cold, where the echoes of past triumphs are drowned out by the wind and the cries of the perishing. Rewind. The year is 1811, bleeding into 1812. Europe, a continent you remade with blood and brilliance, trembles at your name. You stand at the apex of your power, maps redrawn, ancient dynasties humbled, family members seated on conquered thrones like minor deities. Your grand economic weapon, the continental system, a vast, choking chain forged to strangle Britain, grips the coastline, a defiant fist against the waves. Yet the chain chafes across the sprawling reaches of the East. Russia, your erstwhile ally bound by treaty, begins to ignore your decrees. They trade with England, a pinprick defiance that feels like betrayal. Your pride, as vast as the empire itself, is wounded. Your vision for Europe, a continent subservient to Paris, a unified weapon against the island nemesis, feels incomplete, vulnerable as long as Russia stands outside your absolute control. You see the Tsar not just as a disobedient friend, but as the final, colossal piece on the geopolitical chessboard that must be dominated to truly isolate and defeat your eternal enemy. The decision crystallizes. Inevitable, in the crucible of your ambition, you will force Russia back into line. You assemble a force unlike any seen before on European soil, the Grande Armée. Hundreds of thousands of men, a kaleidoscope of nationalities bound by allegiance or coercion. French veterans, Italian conscripts, eager German princes with their contingents, Polish patriots dreaming of a restored homeland, stoic Dutch engineers. They march eastward, a human tide flowing towards the horizon, their confidence a mirror of your own. They believe in your star, in the myth that you, Napoleon, cannot fail. Voices whisper warnings about Russia's immense size, its brutal, endless winters, the lack of roads swallowing armies whole, the stubborn, resilient spirit of its people. These warnings reach your ears, but they sound like static, like doubt in a world where only certainty matters. Your intelligence reports, even those painting a grim picture, are dismissed or subtly reshaped in your mind to fit the narrative of inevitable victory. You are accustomed to enemies folding, to ancient capitals falling in days, to battles decided by a single glorious maneuver. Russia will be no different. This moment, this turning towards the east with such overwhelming force and such unwavering confidence, is the first clear whisper of hubris. It is here, perhaps more than anywhere before, that success hardens into an armor that deflects necessary truth. When victory becomes the only thinkable outcome, dissenting opinions cease to be strategic input and begin to sound like disloyalty or cowardice. The strategic mind, once so sharp and adaptable, starts to become a prisoner of the conquering ego, seeing only what it wants to see. Consider this. What happens when the greatest threat isn't the enemy's strength, but the challenges you simply refuse to take seriously? Ask yourself, standing in his boots, on the precipice of such a monumental undertaking, convinced of your own infallibility, could you have heard the warnings? The greatest threats often arise from the challenges you refuse to acknowledge. This march begins not just across Europe, but into the dangerous territory of your own unchecked belief. June 1812. The Niemen River stretches before you, a border not just between nations, but between your known world and the vast, unpredictable expanse of Russia. The Grande Armée begins to cross. Not just an army, but a migration of empires. Pontoons bridge the water, a temporary artery for this colossal force. 400,000 men, horses, cannons, wagons loaded with supplies that seem at this moment inexhaustible. It is a spectacle of power unmatched in human history, a testament to your organizational genius and sheer force of will. You expect resistance at the border, a grand confrontation where your veterans and your strategy will smash Tsar Alexander's forces, forcing a quick peace, a humbled Russia brought into your sphere. This is the plan, the beautiful geometric calculation. But as the endless columns march eastward, the expected enemy does not appear. The Russians retreat, ever deeper. Villages are deserted, then burned. Fields are scorched, resources systematically destroyed. It's not a battle, it's an advance into an emptiness that begins to feel increasingly hostile. This isn't a retreat born of fear, you realize, but a deliberate strategy. The enemy is the land itself, the distance, the lack of infrastructure, the deliberate scarcity. Your supply lines, stretched thin across these primitive routes, begin to fray almost immediately. Wagons break down, provisions spoil or are consumed faster than they can be replaced. The meticulously planned logistics struggle against the sheer scale and the void the enemy is creating. Discipline, so vital to holding such a diverse force together, starts to erode in the absence of immediate conflict and the presence of growing hardship. Men forage, straggle, desert. The army's true strength lay not just in its numbers on paper, but in the seamless flow of supplies and the unbreakable cohesion of its units. Both are now being systematically targeted by an enemy who refuses to engage on your terms. This isn't just inconvenient, it is strategically devastating. Here lies the crucial insight. Your brilliance on the battlefield, your ability to maneuver and strike decisively, is useless if you cannot get your army there, sustained and intact. Strategy isn't just about where you fight, but how you manage the million unglamorous details that allow you to fight at all. Ignoring the environment, the infrastructure, the sheer administrative complexity of feeding and equipping 500,000 men hundreds of miles from their base. This is a critical failure, no matter how perfect your battle plan against an enemy who would stand and fight. Ask yourself, is true ambition about the grand vision or about the meticulous, often boring, administrative competence required to make that vision a reality? Perhaps the greatest battles are won or lost before the first shot is fired, in the ledgers and on the dusty roads of supply lines. You are discovering, perhaps too late, that a grand vision without administrative competence is a house built on sand, and the Russian landscape is a relentless tide. You press deeper into the vastness. Weeks bleed into months, the sun relentless, then the chill setting in. Each dawn, you anticipate the clash, the grand maneuver you've built your career on, the decisive battle that will shatter the enemy and end this campaign swiftly. But the main Russian army, under the cautious, calculating hand of Barclay de Tolly, simply isn't there to meet you head-on. They melt away, trading space for time, executing a strategic withdrawal that is as frustratingly effective as it is infuriatingly passive from your perspective. This isn't a conventional war against formations you can outflank or outthink in a pitched battle. This is a war against distance itself, against emptiness. Each step forward stretches your supply lines thinner than a spider's silk, leaving your Grande Armée, the instrument of your will, honed for speed and shock, exhausted, depleted. Your magnificent cavalry, the eyes and fists of the army, loses horses at an alarming rate to fatigue and lack of fodder. The land itself becomes a silent, implacable adversary. It offers no bounty, no welcoming villages, only endless forests, swamps, and plains that swallow your strength and morale. Frustration festers among your generals, murmuring voices questioning the wisdom of chasing a mirage. Your soldiers, once invincible, march with weary, hollow eyes. The swift, glorious campaign you envisioned dissolves into a grinding, endless pilgrimage into the unknown. You issue proclamations, attempting to ignite revolutionary fervor in the occupied territories, promising liberation from the Tsar. But the Russian peasantry regards you with suspicion, sometimes outright hostility, not as a liberator, but another foreign invader disrupting their harsh, deeply traditional world. They burn their own homes, denying you shelter and supplies, an act of resistance born of desperation and fierce cultural pride you tragically underestimated. You are fighting an enemy you cannot pin down, in the land you do not understand, against a people who refuse to play by your rules. This deliberate evasion, this willingness to suffer and yield territory rather than risk annihilation, is a strategy in itself, one your rapid, aggressive tactics are ill-suited to counter. It reveals a fatal blind spot, underestimating the cultural resilience, the deep, almost mystical connection of the enemy to their land, and their willingness to endure unimaginable hardship to defend it. This wasn't just a military withdrawal, it was an act of national defiance, weaponizing the very geography and soul of Russia against you. Ask yourself, how do you defeat an enemy whose greatest weapon is their own territory and their refusal to stand and fight on your terms? True leadership here demanded adaptation, a fundamental shift in strategy, perhaps even a painful recognition that reality was refusing to bend to your will. Instead, you pressed on, drawn deeper into the trap, chasing an elusive enemy into the heart of an unforgiving land. This relentless pursuit, born of impatience and a need to force the decisive moment, became the very mechanism of your undoing. Be wary of an enemy who has nothing left to lose but the ground beneath their feet. They will make you pay for every inch. Near Moscow, the long, grinding march finally ends. The Russians, under the wily veteran Kutuzov, turn to face you. The ground around Berezina becomes the stage you craved, the site of the decisive battle that will force the Tsar's hand. Two massive armies, nearly 250,000 men combined, stand poised. The air crackles with anticipation, heavy with the scent of damp earth and nervous energy. Then, the dawn breaks, and the world descends into a chaotic, thunderous hell. The ground doesn't just shake, it howls under the relentless bombardment of 1,000 cannons. This is no elegant maneuver, it's a brutal, day-long meat grinder. Waves of infantry crash against fortified positions, cavalry charges splinter against bayonet lines. The casualties mount with sickening, unimaginable speed. Tens of thousands fall in hours, French, Russian, their blood soaking the fields, mingling in the ditches and redoubts. You are there, on the field, directing the flow of battle. But some observers note a strange difference. A perceived lack of your usual explosive decisiveness. Perhaps it's the toll of the campaign, the weight of command, or perhaps, as some accounts suggest, a physical ailment, a fever, a chill. dulling your sharp edge. There is a hesitation, a debated reluctance to commit the Imperial Guard, your ultimate reserve, at moments where their weight might have shattered the Russian lines irrevocably. It's a surprising deviation from the audacity that built your empire. By evening, the carnage is almost beyond comprehension. The Russians have been pushed back from key positions. They've suffered horrendous losses, but their army is not broken. They hold patches of ground, their lines bent but not snapped. Yet the next day, they retreat, leaving you in possession of the field. You claim victory, and technically, strategically, you have won the battle. But look at the cost. Your army is maimed. The irreplaceable veterans, the core of seasoned soldiers who understood your tactics implicitly, lie dead or wounded in the fields. The Russian army, though battered, survived. It retreated intact enough to fight another day. You won the tactical engagement, yes, but failed utterly to achieve the strategic objective, the annihilation of the enemy force that could continue the war. This is the brutal lesson etched in the blood-soaked earth of Berezina. Some victories come at a cost so high they function as defeats. Winning a single battle doesn't mean winning the war if the enemy's core strength remains. You took the objective, the field. But the sustainability and strategic value of that outcome were crippled by the price paid. Ask yourself, what value is a victory that cripples you as much or more than your foe? What would you have done standing on that hill near Berezina, seeing the horrific cost mount? The road to Moscow is open, but the path is paved with the bodies of the very men you needed to conquer an empire. September 14th, 1812. You ride into Moscow. This is it, the heart of the bear, the ancient capital of Russia. After the bloodbath at Berezina, after months of relentless marching across endless plains, this should be the apotheosis of your campaign, the triumphant entry that forces Tsar Alexander to his knees. You expect church bells, maybe even protests, but certainly a delegation. Boyars in their furs offering bread and salt, the keys to the city, ready to negotiate terms of surrender. The ultimate prize is within your grasp, but as your boots touch the cobbled streets, something is profoundly wrong. The expected fanfare is replaced by an eerie, unsettling silence. The windows are dark, shuttered like dead eyes. The streets are empty, swept clean not by diligent servants, but by the absence of life. Moscow is not surrendering. Moscow is gone. Its inhabitants, on the orders of Governor Rostopchin, have fled, taking everything they could, leaving behind only buildings, a hollow shell echoing with the arrival of a conqueror who finds he has conquered a void. This isn't a conquest, it's an occupation of a ghost city. The strategic symbol is yours, but the substance, the ability to force peace, has evaporated like morning mist. The psychological blow is immense. You have chased the Russian army across 1,000 miles, bled for a decisive battle, and finally reached their sacred capital, only to find it intentionally rendered worthless. It's a brutal lesson in centers of gravity. You focused on the geographic objective, the map marker, believing taking Moscow would force the issue. But Russia's true center of gravity wasn't its capital. It was its vastness, its willingness to endure, and its refusal to play by your rules. They ceded territory, sacrificed their holy city, because their ultimate goal was not to defend ground, but to preserve their army and their will to fight. Ask yourself, Is a trophy still valuable if the enemy intentionally breaks it before you claim it? You stand in the deserted Kremlin, surrounded by empty palaces, and the silence mocks your ambition. You have won a city, but lost the strategic leverage you craved. This was the moment you discovered that sometimes the greatest victory your opponent can achieve is making you realize you've triumphed over nothing. A hollow victory is, perhaps, the most bitter defeat of all. The air grows cold, and you can almost hear the wind whisper the tragic irony. You took their capital, but they took your objective. You march into Moscow, the heart of the ancient empire, the prize for which you bled across a continent. Silence greets you, an unsettling calm where fanfare was expected. The city is vast, ornate, yet eerily empty. Your army, exhausted but elated, occupies the key points, the Kremlin secured. Surely, this is the turning point. You anticipate delegates, terms, the capitulation that conquering a capital must force. But victory, it seems, has a bitter taste. Within days, a new kind of chaos erupts. Smoke appears, thin tendrils at first, then billowing plumes. Fires, not random sparks, but deliberate acts. They erupt across the city, simultaneous and relentless. Started by retreating soldiers, perhaps, ordered from above, or ignited by desperate looters, seizing their chance in the void of authority. The exact origin remains debated, a fog of war clinging to the flames themselves. But the effect is undeniable, apocalyptic. Moscow is built largely of wood, a tinderbox waiting for a spark. The wind, an unseen accomplice, whips the flames into a frenzy. The heat is unbearable, the roar deafening. You are forced to flee the Kremlin, the very symbol of power you claimed, as fire licks at its ancient walls. It's an ignominious retreat, escaping your own conquest. For days, Moscow is an inferno, a vast funeral pyre for your hopes. The city you envisioned as winter quarters, a supply hub, a bargaining chip, is consumed. Your soldiers watch, horrified as their shelter, their potential salvation from the elements and dwindling rations, turns to ash. The supply situation, already stretched thinner than a thread over a chasm, becomes instantly catastrophic. There is nothing left to forage, nowhere to shelter the army. This burning is not mere destruction. It is a message etched in fire across the skyline. The Russians are screaming their defiance. They will destroy their own sacred spaces, their history, their wealth, rather than let the invader profit. It's a level of fanatical resolve you hadn't truly fathomed. You had anticipated resistance, battles, even scorched earth tactics in the countryside. But the calculated, self-inflicted annihilation of their own revered capital? That was beyond your calculations. Your assumption that taking the capital would invariably force the Tsar's hand, compel negotiations, is literally going up in smoke. You are stranded in the ruins of a city you didn't want, a charnel house of timber and stone, with an army you couldn't possibly feed or shelter, facing an enemy who refuses to yield anything, least of all their will. This wasn't just a military setback. It was a profound misreading of the Russian soul. A stark reminder that sometimes the greatest weapon is an opponent's willingness to sacrifice everything you desire. Consider this. What does it mean to conquer a place that destroys itself to deny you victory? Is true power seizing assets or understanding what your enemy values more than life or property? The ashes of Moscow offer a chilling insight. Underestimating an opponent's willingness to sacrifice everything is not just a tactical error, it can be an empire's undoing. Some things are more important than physical assets, even a capital city. You stand in the chilling ruins of Moscow, a city you burned to spite the Tsar, now a cage of ash and stone. Over a month ticks by. The golden days of autumn, once a promise of swift victory or decisive retreat, bleed into a biting wind that carries the scent of coming snow. You pace the desolate chambers, eyes fixed on the horizon, waiting for the white flag, for the envoy from Tsar Alexander I, for the kneeling plea for terms. But silence is the only reply. Your messengers, dispatched to the Tsar's court, are not just rebuffed, they are ignored. As if you, Napoleon, the master of Europe, simply do not exist. This is a reality so alien, so profoundly unsettling, that your mind struggles to process it. He is used to dictating terms, to enemies crumbling under the weight of his victories, to monarchs begging for mercy in antechambers. The idea that Alexander would simply refuse to play the part assigned to him, the defeated supplicant, seems not just improbable, but impossible. Around you, your marshals grow restless, their faces etched with deepening concern. Murat, nay, Berthier, they urge retreat. The army, once the Grande Armée, the invincible engine of conquest, is wasting away. Supplies are dwindling, morale is plummeting, and the endless Russian plains are stretching out like a death sentence in the imagination. But you hesitate. You cling to a phantom limb of diplomacy, a desperate, lingering hope that Alexander will break, that the sheer audacity of your presence in his sacred capital will force his hand. This waiting, this paralysis in the face of undeniable fact, is perhaps the most profound, most tragic display of lethal ego and detachment in your career. You are substituting your desired reality, the one where opponents bow to your will, for the harsh, unforgiving facts on the ground. The snow begins to fall, a soft, insidious dusting that portends the monstrous blizzard to come. Each flake is a tick of the clock, a silent, undeniable warning that you choose to ignore. You are shielded by a powerful insulator, the belief in your own invincibility, forged by 2 decades of unprecedented success. This shield, once your greatest strength, now blinds you to the inconvenient truths whispered by the wind and shouted by your worried generals. The army weakens, the horses starve, the ammunition dwindles. The reality of the situation cares nothing for the Emperor Napoleon's reputation or past glories. It is a brutal, indifferent force of nature and circumstance, advancing with the relentless pace of winter itself. You believe your own narrative over the observable facts. It is a catastrophic self-deception playing out on a continental scale. The Tsar is not coming. The terms will not be offered. The time to act was weeks ago, and now the window is slamming shut. Ask yourself, when have you clung to a belief, a desired outcome, even when all evidence pointed to a different, harsher reality? What price would you pay for believing your own narrative over the inconvenient truth? Standing in the ruins of Moscow, surrounded by an army that is slowly freezing and starving, Napoleon learns that reality doesn't negotiate. And the consequences are about to become terrifyingly clear. Mid-October, Moscow looms behind you, a city you conquered, but which refused to yield its soul. The Tsar remains silent, the hoped-for peace treaty, a mirage shimmering in the deepening cold. You stand in the chill air, the biting wind a premonition. Too late. The truth, colder than any Russian winter, settles over you. With surrender still a defiant refusal, and the first harsh fingers of the season closing in, the order is finally given. Retreat. The Grande Armée, once a tidal wave sweeping across Europe, turns its back on the conquered empty city. In these initial stages, a semblance of order holds, though it's a fragile facade. The columns are burdened, not just by the weariness of months of campaigning, but by something far more insidious. Wagons piled high with the glittering spoils of Moscow. Golden icons, silver plates, ermine cloaks, treasures that should have been left behind, or whose transport capacity should have been dedicated to vital supplies, food, medicine, winter gear. They slow the pace, a physical manifestation of ambition's heavy cost, lumbering anchors dragging at the army's speed. A desperate spark ignites. You attempt a different route, hoping to swing south, away from the well-trodden, picked-over northern road. You envision untouched villages, supplies to forage, a less direct path back to relative safety. It's a gamble, a feint against fate itself, but history sometimes is a relentless pursuer. At Maloyaroslavets, the gamble crumbles. A brutal, bloody skirmish erupts, and there, blocking your path, is Kutuzov's army, not routed, not defeated, but a persistent, watchful predator, cutting off your desired escape. The road south is closed. There is no alternative now. You are forced back onto the northern route, the very path you carved eastward with such confidence months before. But this isn't the same road. It's a scar across the landscape, stripped bare by the passage of 500,000 men and horses on their advance, and then ravaged further by the retreating Russians and the land itself. The fields are empty husks, the villages smoldering ruins, picked clean of anything remotely useful. There are no supplies to forage, no shelter to be found against the growing chill. The long march into Russia, a strategic masterpiece in concept, has become a desperate, fatal struggle in reverse over the bones of its own making. The path of retreat is determined by the path of advance, and if that path was unsustainable on the way in, it becomes a death trap on the way out. The weather, initially a manageable cold, a crispness in the air, will soon transform. It will become a merciless killer, a white, blinding enemy more devastating than any Cossack charge. The retreat isn't just a strategic withdrawal. It's a desperate losing race against time, against nature's unleashed fury, and against a relentless enemy nipping at your flanks. It's a race you've already lost, perhaps, in those weeks spent waiting in Moscow, convinced the Tsar would bend. Every creaking wagon of loot, every wasted day, every mile retraced over barren ground is a testament to a plan that accounted for the glorious forward march, but failed to prepare for the brutal, difficult journey back. Ask yourself, is this the consequence of strategic miscalculation or the inevitable price of boundless hubris? The road back is not merely a path. It is a descent into a living nightmare. As you trudge westward, the already biting cold intensifies, a physical enemy far more relentless than any Russian army. The mercury plummets, days bleed into nights of unimaginable frigidity, and the snow falls relentlessly, burying hopes as deeply as it buries the corpses lining the route. The Grande Armée, once a symbol of seemingly unstoppable power, is no more. It has fractured, splintered into a desperate, struggling mass of individuals, each one consumed by the singular, brutal instinct for survival. Thousands upon thousands simply cease to move, freezing where they stand or collapsing by the roadside, silent testament to the cruel indifference of the elements. Horses, the engines of war and transport, fall in their tracks, their flesh immediately set upon by starving soldiers, a gruesome feast born of utter desperation. Discipline, that iron framework that had held this vast force together, evaporates like mist in the biting wind. Officers lose control, their commands unheard or ignored by men whose only focus is finding a scrap of food, a piece of shelter, a moment of warmth. Weapons, once sacred extensions of a soldier's purpose, are cast aside, too heavy, too cold to the touch, useless against this foe. They are traded for a crust of bread, burned for a fleeting moment of heat, or simply discarded to lighten the crushing burden of existence. The stories whispered along this frozen hell are almost too horrific to comprehend. Tales of cannibalism, of men fighting savagely over the frozen remains of their comrades or fallen animals, of the dead stripped bare of their clothing moments after drawing their last breath, their naked bodies left exposed to the elements as the living scavenged for any protection against the cold. The Cossacks, led by figures like Platov, are specters on the flanks and rear, not engaging in pitched battles, but preying on the weak, the straggling, the utterly broken. They are the wolves harrying a dying herd. The finest army in the world is reduced to a haunting procession, a specter of its former glory, pursued not just by the enemy, but by starvation, frostbite, and the pervasive, soul-crushing cold. Here, rank and title mean nothing. Authority dissolves when a leader cannot provide the most basic necessities: warmth, food, safety. The emperor, though still miles ahead, feels impossibly distant to these suffering souls. This is the stark, brutal truth that extreme conditions reveal. The veneer of civilization, of military hierarchy, is thin. Strip away food and shelter, and all that remains is the raw, brutal will to survive, often at any cost. Consider this: the Grande Armée was built on loyalty forged in victory and shared purpose. Yet in the face of utter collapse and the failure to provide basic human needs, that loyalty crumbles into dust. Ask yourself, what is the value of grand strategy or territorial gain when the very foundation of your power, the lives and well-being of your people, is dissolving before your eyes? This isn't just a military defeat. It's a fundamental failure of leadership, a tragic testament to the fact that true authority is earned and maintained not on the parade ground, but in the shared trenches of suffering. Neglecting the basic needs of those who follow you doesn't just weaken you, it utterly destroys the foundation of your power. The Berezina, the name itself, becomes a chokehold in the history books, a bottleneck carved from ice and despair. You stand on its banks, the remnants of the Grande Armée, a shuffling, shivering mass behind you. The Russian vise is closing. Chikagov's army is to the south, Wittgenstein's to the north, aiming to pin you against this frozen river and complete the annihilation. There is no turning back, no flanking, only this obstacle and the converging doom. It is here, in the face of utter catastrophe wrought by your own decisions in the vast, unforgiving East, that a different kind of leadership emerges, not from the emperor, but from the ranks. General Eble and his pontooniers, the bridging engineers, are the heroes of this particular horrific act. For days, they wade into the freezing, slushy water, working with desperate speed, their hands freezing to timber and rope. They build 2 pontoon bridges, not under enemy fire initially, but under the relentless, deadly assault of the cold itself. They know they are sacrificing their lives. Few of them will survive the exposure and exhaustion. Yet they build. They build a fragile path over the abyss. The scenes that unfold are apocalyptic. As soon as one bridge is ready, the rush begins. Soldiers, officers, camp followers, wounded, horses, cannons, everything surges forward in a frenzy of self-preservation. Discipline, the bedrock of your armies, dissolves into animal panic. The bridges groan, then buckle under the weight. The southern bridge, hastily constructed, collapses first, sending hundreds, maybe thousands, screaming into the icy current. The northern bridge becomes the single thread of hope, a narrow causeway over hell. You are here, moving between the desperate scramble at the crossing and the embattled rear guard. Sometimes you are rallying men on the bridgehead, directing the flow, a figure of authority trying to impose order on chaos. At other times, you are with the rear guard, your marshals like Ney, fighting a brutal, stubborn action against the closing Russian net. These men, the brave, the loyal, the utterly spent, hold the line, buying precious hours for the others to cross. They know their fate is sealed. They are the sacrifice offered to the river god, a grim toll paid in blood and frostbite so that others might live. The cost is unimaginable. Thousands drown, crushed, frozen. The banks are littered with abandoned cannons, wagons, and bodies. It is a graveyard of ambition, frozen solid. Yet tens of thousands do cross. They are saved, not by a brilliant maneuver from the high command, but by the sheer, incredible grit and self-sacrifice of those engineers working in the deathly water, and the desperate courage of the rear guard holding back the inevitable. Here is a brutal truth. Even the most powerful leader, brought low by their own mistakes, must sometimes rely entirely on the humble, anonymous courage of their followers for survival. The Berezina is a testament to both the catastrophic consequences of hubris and the astonishing capacity for heroism in ordinary men pushed beyond the limits of endurance. Look at the faces of those engineers, their flesh turning blue as they hammer home the planks. Look at the handful of grenadiers selling their lives dearly as the Cossacks swarm around them. What would you have done, watching this unfold, knowing their sacrifice was buying your escape? This river crossing, often cited as a symbol of Napoleon's retreat and defeat, is also a dark monument to human resilience. You survive the Berezina, yes, but the image of those faces in the water, of the soldiers deliberately left behind to die, is burned into your memory. It is a heavy weight to carry, perhaps the heaviest of all. The cost of this leadership, of this ambition, is counted not in territory lost or battles failed, but in the silent, frozen suffering of the men who trusted you. Acknowledge their sacrifice. History demands it. Mid-December 1812, the wreckage stretches across the frozen landscape, a trail of human and equine misery etched in snow and ice. The Grande Armée, once 500,000 strong, is a ghost. Barely 40,000 effective fighting men now stumble westward, pursued by Cossacks, ravaged by frostbite, starvation, and despair. Every step is a battle against death itself. Amidst this unfolding catastrophe, a critical, controversial decision is made. You look at the maps, the reports from Paris. Unrest is brewing, plots are whispered. The news of the disaster, filtering through the controlled channels, is enough to shake the foundations of the regime. Your physical presence is not just desired, it is deemed essential to stabilize the empire, to rally the fractured state, and most importantly, to conjure a new army from a nation weary of war. So under the cloak of necessity, you prepare to leave. Marshal Murat, a man of unquestioned bravery on the battlefield, but perhaps less suited for the complexities of command in retreat, is given control. Then, with a small, trusted entourage, you slip away. Traveling by sleigh, wrapped against the biting cold, often incognito, you embark on a breakneck journey back to the heart of your power. It is a journey of stark contrast, leaving behind the hellish reality of the retreat for the political chessboard of the capital. For the freezing, starving soldiers left on the road, abandoned to the horrors they now face daily, the perception is brutal. You are leaving them in this inferno while you escape to safety, warmth, and power. While the strategic logic is undeniable, someone had to reach Paris to secure the empire and raise the hundreds of thousands of men needed to defend it. It is a stark demonstration of the brutal calculus of power. The individual suffering, the immense human cost of the retreat, is secondary to the survival of the state apparatus and, implicitly, your continued rule within it. This act carves an indelible mark on your legacy and the relationship with those you commanded. It highlights a chilling insight. Leaders must sometimes make choices that are politically necessary, but morally fraught. Prioritizing the greater good, or perhaps the survival of their own power base, over the immediate welfare of their followers, is a heavy burden. It is the price of detachment, a necessity for strategic thinking, but one that can erode trust and be perceived, rightly or wrongly, as cold-hearted abandonment. Ask yourself, was this the pragmatic, necessary move of a leader saving his empire, or the calculated, cold-blooded escape of a man prioritizing his own survival above all else? What would you have done, standing on the edge of that frozen wasteland, facing ruin on two fronts? The journey back to Paris might save the throne, but it costs something irreplaceable on the icy roads of Russia. You step back into the cold heart of Paris. The grand buildings stand oblivious to the frozen hell you have just escaped, but the whispers precede you. The silence of the return, the lack of fanfare, speaks volumes even before the official word. Your immediate task is not rest, but resurrection. Of an army, yes, but first, of the narrative. The truth of Russia is a bitter poison, and it must be diluted, spun, controlled. The 29th Bulletin of the Grande Armée. This document becomes your primary weapon in the first days home. It is a masterpiece of selective truth and strategic omission. You dictate the words, shaping the disaster into something survivable, even understandable. The Emperor's health has never been better. It boldly proclaims, a stark, almost defiant lie against the backdrop of shattered health and frozen limbs. The crushing losses? Acknowledged, but attributed not to strategic miscalculation or fatal delay, but to general winter, to the elements, the true, unconquerable enemy. The retreat is painted as a harsh necessity, a strategic withdrawal forced by nature's cruelty, not a panicked flight from an unraveling campaign. This is the core historical decision. To lie, strategically and massively, to buy time. You leverage every ounce of your charisma, your sheer force of will, to project strength where there is profound weakness. The bulletin is disseminated, reprinted, read in town squares. For a time, it holds back the tide of despair, stems the rising panic among the populace and the political elite. You are back. Therefore, France is not defeated. Simultaneously, the summons goes out. Every village, every town feels the call. Conscripts are demanded. Boys, old men, anyone remotely capable of holding a musket. Resources are scraped from the bone of the nation. Forge fires roar to replace lost cannons. Tailors sew uniforms for limbs that have never marched more than a few miles. It is a national mobilization on a scale seen only during the revolution itself, driven by the same desperate energy, funneled now through your singular command. You are extracting the final reserves of blood and treasure from a weary, grieving France. War energy is terrifying, inspiring. You are everywhere, meeting ministers, generals, factory owners, cajoling, threatening, demanding. A new army will be built. But look closer. This is not the Grande Armée of 1812, the hardened veterans of a dozen campaigns, the cavalry forged in the fires of Austerlitz and Jena, the artillery masters whose aim was deadly precise. This new force is green, terrified, lacking the muscle memory of war. The horses? Scrawny nags compared to the magnificent beasts lost in the snow. The equipment? Hastily made, inferior. This army is a ghost of the one that marched east, a pale imitation built on sheer political will and national desperation. Here lies a surprising detail often overlooked, the qualitative chasm between the army lost and the army raised. The narrative spin worked for a time, summoning bodies, but it could not conjure back lost experience, could not replace the thousands of skilled non-commissioned officers who were the backbone of the Grande Armée. The reservoir of trust, drained by the sheer scale of the Russian loss, and the material resources of France are both running low. You have raised an army, yes, but its foundation is built on sand and spun words. Ask yourself, is this incredible resilience and political mastery, or a desperate gamble born of the inability to admit the full, terrifying extent of the defeat? What would you have done, knowing the truth of those frozen fields, standing once again on Parisian soil? The spin delays the reckoning, but the reality is already marching towards you, not with the speed of cavalry, but with the steady, relentless tread of consequence. The biting wind that swept across the Russian plains carried more than just snow. It carried whispers. Whispers of a grand army shattered, of frozen bodies lining endless roads, of a myth broken. Despite your frantic efforts to control the narrative, to paint the retreat as a strategic withdrawal, the truth, brutal and stark, leaked out like lifeblood from a mortal wound. Europe smells blood. Suddenly, the alliances forged in victory and fear begin to fray. Prussia, long chafing under your dominance, sees its moment. General York, commanding the Prussian corps ostensibly allied with you, makes a unilateral decision, the Convention of Tauroggen. He signs an armistice with the Russians, effectively defecting. It's more than a military maneuver. It's a declaration of independence, a spark lighting the dry tinder of German nationalism. You yourself, ironically, helped ignite. You had redrawn their maps, dismantled their ancient states. yet unified them in resentment. Now, that resentment finds its voice. Austria, your former enemy and now grudging ally through marriage, observes with calculating eyes. Metternich, the architect of their policy, begins a slow, deliberate pivot. They don't immediately declare war, but their posture shifts from ally to mediator, a thinly veiled step towards opposition. The Empress Marie-Louise is your wife, yes, but the Habsburg Empire is a dynastic entity, not a sentimental one. They sense the balance of power shifting, and they position themselves for the inevitable fall. Even Sweden, a nation you once brought into your continental system, turns against you. And who stands at their head? Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, one of your own marshals, elected crown prince. The man you once commanded, who clashed with you, who held a simmering ambition you perhaps underestimated, now prepares to lead Swedish troops against the empire he helped build. Is there a sharper irony in history than seeing your own protégé leading the charge of your enemies? It's as if the very stones you laid in your foundation are now being hurled back at you. Across the Channel, Britain, your persistent nemesis, redoubles its efforts. The continental system, designed to cripple them, is collapsing as ports reopen and nations seek trade routes free from your decree. With the main continental powers stirring, their NATO blockade tightens, and their subsidies flow freely to fuel the burgeoning coalition. The catastrophic losses in Russia didn't just deplete your ranks, they shattered your aura. The emperor who seemed invincible, the master of the battlefield, was defeated not by an enemy army, but by distance, logistics, and winter. The nations you had conquered, coerced, or simply intimidated now see not a god of war, but a man. Vulnerable and wounded, the chains you imposed across the continent are beginning to rattle, sensing they can be broken. This wasn't just a military defeat. It was the collapse of psychological dominance, a continental shift from awe to defiance. Ask yourself, was the campaign in Russia a single miscalculation, or the inevitable consequence of an ambition that had become deaf to reality? What ripple effects are you triggering by simply surviving? The spring of 1813 dawns, cold but alive with the desperate energy of war. The ghost of Russia still chills your bones, a constant ache in your strategies, and the thinning ranks of your army. Yet you rise. The war of the Sixth Coalition is upon you, a tempest of nations determined to finally extinguish the light you carry. Prussia, Russia, Austria, Sweden. They are united, their fear of your power now overshadowed by a shared, burning vengeance. Even now, amidst the wreckage of your grand army, you haven't lost your touch. You move like a maestro conducting chaos, winning victories at Lutzen and Bautzen. You demonstrate flashes of that old brilliance, outmaneuvering larger forces, proving your tactical genius remains sharp as ever. These aren't the lightning campaigns of the past, though. Each victory is costly, bought with the lives of young conscripts, the Marie-Louises, inexperienced and untested. Your veterans lie frozen beneath Russian snows. Your cavalry, the eyes and ears of your army, is decimated. Your resources, the very lifeblood of war, are stretched thin, hemorrhaging from years of relentless conflict and blockade. This is no longer the quick skirmishes of earlier wars, where you could divide and conquer, picking off opponents one by one. This is a united front, fueled by collective grievance and armed with hard-won lessons from past defeats. They avoid decisive engagement when they can, knowing time is on their side. that your manpower and resources dwindle with every passing month. They have learned to fight you differently, using Fabian tactics, retreating and attacking only when they hold the overwhelming advantage. It all converges in October, around the ancient Saxon city of Leipzig. Here, the storm breaks in full fury. The battle of nations unfolds, an unprecedented clash of armies, a collision of nearly 500,000 men. From every direction, the forces of Europe converge on your position. Prussians marching with grim determination, Russians fueled by righteous anger from 1812, Austrians seeking to restore their humbled pride, Swedes led by one of your own former marshals, Bernadotte, now a king plotting your downfall. You position your forces skillfully, anticipating their movements, attempting to use the terrain and the rivers to your advantage. You fight with characteristic tenacity, pushing back attacks, launching counter-offensives. The fighting is brutal. City streets become charnel houses. Fields are soaked crimson. But for every corps you deploy, they have two waiting. For every cannon you fire, their batteries unleash a deafening barrage. The sheer crushing weight of their numbers, the depth of their reserves, the endless flow of their ammunition and supplies. It is overwhelming. It is a maelstrom you cannot control, but tide you cannot push back. The lines buckle. Allies waver. Some even switch sides mid-battle, a final, bitter betrayal that stabs deeper than any enemy bayonet. The bridges, your only route of retreat, are blown prematurely in a panic, trapping thousands of your soldiers on the wrong side of the river. It is chaos, a rout, an undeniable, brutal fact. Leipzig is a clear, decisive defeat. Your shield in Germany is shattered. The empire you built brick by blood-soaked brick is forced back, retreating behind the Rhine, back to the borders of France itself. The consequences of that long, disastrous march to Moscow in 1812 are now being paid in full on the blood-soaked fields of Saxony. You didn't just lose an army in Russia. You galvanized your enemies and convinced the waverers that you could indeed be beaten. You created the very conditions that forced these disparate nations to unite against you. The road back to France is no triumphant return, but a bitter, harried retreat. Your enemies, emboldened by victory, pursue you relentlessly, the scent of final victory in their nostrils. Consider this. Even the greatest tactical genius, a mind capable of reshaping continents, can be undone not just by a single mistake, but by the cumulative weight of strategic blunders that alienate allies and empower enemies. Success wasn't solely about your own capabilities. It was also ultimately about the collective strength, resources, and determination of your opponents, especially when you created the conditions that forced them to unite. Ask yourself, is true strength only about your own power, or is it also about maintaining the conditions that prevent your foes from combining theirs? What happens when hubris blinds you to the gathering storm? The Allied armies pour across your borders, a flood tide overwhelming the land you claimed as yours. It is 1814. You, Napoleon, the master strategist, muster your last strength for a final campaign. The flashes of old brilliance ignite once more. Lightning maneuvers, striking isolated columns, snatching small victories from the jaws of inevitable defeat. You dart and weave, a cornered wolf, selling every inch of ground dearly. For a fleeting moment, they see the Emperor of Austerlitz in your eyes, but the light is fading, and the numbers are simply too great. The chessboard is tilted against you. Piece by piece they surround your king. The news arrives like a death knell. Paris has fallen. The heart of your empire, the city you adorned and ruled, is in enemy hands. The strategic situation is hopeless, but your will remains unbroken. You prepare to march on the capital, ready for one last, desperate gamble. But the men who fought by your side for decades, the marshals you elevated and trusted, finally say, enough. At the palace of Fontainebleau, the air thick with unspoken accusations and weary resignation, they confront you. They are generals, yes, but they are also Frenchmen who see the nation bled white, facing utter destruction for the sake of one man's refusal to yield. They refuse to march. This is not just military defeat. It is the collapse of loyalty, the withdrawal of the very foundation of your power. You stand, emperor of nothing, facing the combined weight of external armies and the internal dissent of your most trusted lieutenants. The pressure is crushing, unbearable. To resist further means pointless bloodshed, the ruin of everything you claimed to protect. You are forced to abdicate. The document, drawn up by others, awaits your signature. In the Grand Palace, amidst the ghosts of past glories, you dip your pen. This is the moment your reign ends, not with a bang on the battlefield, but with the scratch of a pen on paper. The empire you built, piece by piece, through force of will and rivers of blood, crumbles around you. The dynasty you envisioned, the future you planned for your son, dissolves into air. They offer you the tiny island of Elba as a sovereign principality, a cruel, ironic kingdom for the man who ruled a continent. Think of it, the boundless ambition that propelled you from the dusty streets of Corsica to the control of Europe, now confined to a rock no one else wanted. This is the nadir. This is profound defeat, raw humiliation, overreach, strategic error, the sheer weight of opposition. They have brought you here. You stand on the edge of an abyss. I'm sorry, I can't assist with that request. How can the man who shaped the world endure being reduced to this? But something, perhaps the same stubborn will that drove you, or a flicker of defiance, pulls you back. You accept your fate. You sign. You will go to Elba. This moment reveals a brutal truth. Power, even that forged in the crucible of genius and war, is conditional. It can be withdrawn, not just by force from without, but by consensus from within, when leadership fails catastrophically. There are, indeed, limits to even the most extraordinary will when faced with unified opposition and depleted resources. Your ambition led you to unimaginable heights, but it also brought you crashing down. Ask yourself, what are you willing to sacrifice for power? And more importantly, what happens when that power is stripped away, when your empire is reduced to a small island, and there is nowhere left to run from the consequences of your failures? How do you face yourself when the world you created lies in ruins around you? The year is 1812. You stand on the Niemen River, one of 600,000 men in the Grande Armée, a force unparalleled in history. Before you lies Russia, a vast, enigmatic land stretching to the horizon. Your emperor, Napoleon, is at his zenith of power, his ambition boundless. He sees not an opponent to negotiate with, but one last obstacle to total mastery of the continent. The decision is made. Invade. It is perhaps the boldest, most audacious move of his career, and it carries within it the seeds of his ultimate undoing. The march begins, a torrent of humanity and steel pouring across the border. But Russia is different. The enemy refuses to stand and fight a decisive battle, melting away like mist, drawing your army deeper into an unforgiving landscape. You advance through scorched villages, past abandoned farms. Supplies dwindle, disease spreads, and the sheer scale of the operation becomes a logistical nightmare. The famous scorched earth tactic isn't just military strategy. It's the land itself, refusing to yield sustenance, turning your path into a trail of dust and despair. You reach Moscow hoping for triumph, perhaps even surrender. Instead, you find an empty city, soon engulfed in flames, a symbolic immolation by its own people, denying you even that meager victory. Now, you are trapped. Winter, the legendary General Winter, descends with brutal speed and ferocity. The retreat is not a strategic withdrawal, it is a death march. Soldiers freeze, starve, are picked off by Cossacks, or simply collapse from exhaustion. The discipline of the Grande Armée evaporates in the blizzard. The river crossings become scenes of unimaginable horror. This wasn't just a military defeat. It was a complete environmental, logistical, and moral collapse. It revealed a critical blind spot. Napoleon's unparalleled strategic brilliance failed to account for the brute force of nature and the indomitable will of a desperate people defending their homeland. He had conquered armies, but he couldn't conquer the winter or the wilderness. Here lies the chilling lesson. Napoleon, the master of detail, the logistical genius of earlier campaigns, allowed his grand vision to override practical realities. He dismissed warnings, underestimated the adversary, both the military and the climate, and stayed too long in Moscow clinging to a false hope. The man who built an empire on seizing opportunity lost it by ignoring limitations. Russia didn't just defeat the Grande Armée, it shattered the myth of Napoleon's invincibility, bleeding his veteran corps white and emboldening every enemy across Europe. The path back was not merely a retreat from Moscow. It was a retreat from the pinnacle of power, a tragic march into the long shadow of his own hubris. Look around you, at the boardrooms and battlefields of the modern world. How often do we see echoes of Napoleon's disastrous march on Moscow? The grand vision unsupported by realistic logistics. The refusal to change course in the face of mounting evidence of failure, the catastrophic consequence of underestimating the opposition or the environment, the price paid by those lower down the chain for decisions made at the top. The story of 1812 is more than a historical footnote. It is a timeless, chilling cautionary tale woven into the fabric of history. It speaks of the limits of power, the enduring strength of reality, and the devastating cost of unchecked ambition. Greatness without self-awareness, ambition without humility, power without prudence. These lead not to lasting empire, but often to ruin and exile. The Russian campaign stripped bare the reality that even the most brilliant mind, when blinded by ego, can be undone by the smallest ignored details. History, in moments like this, whispers a vital truth. Opportunity is nothing without the wisdom to know its limits. It wasn't just the snows of Russia that defeated Napoleon. It was the fire of his own relentless, ultimately self-destructive ambition. The echoes of that fall resonate even today, a stark reminder that sometimes the most dangerous enemy you face is the one looking back from the mirror. In the end, it wasn't the battlefield that defeated him. It was believing he couldn't lose.